Hello everyone, and welcome to the Office of Online Learning virtual trainings for converting your class to an online format. Here's an overview. We're really going to provide some support on reimagining your class in an online format. So how do we take something that you've done on the ground class and convert it into an online presentation for your students in the best way possible? We're going to provide some guidance on creating your online content and measuring student learning in regards to best practices. So two of the main focuses as we go through this training is helping to identify the essential learning. And when I thought about this concept when I was converting my classes, it really helped me to make sure that I wasn't adding too much clutter into my classes. It helped me to really funnel down what are the essential objectives and the essential learning outcomes that I want my students to get out of this course, this unit, and this activity. So my goal is to walk you through and provide some modeling as to how to really do this process and identify the essential learning for your classes. The second focus of this online training is universal design. How do we design an online course so that any student who walks in or logs into our class can access our content and can have an opportunity to learn, regardless of their learning preferences, their background. How do we make learning as accessible and meaningful for as many students as possible? So to break down the essential learning, really what we want to ask ourselves is, what do we want students to be able to do after our course? And I teach a lot of special education courses, and I'm preparing teachers to teach. And so for me, I'm really trying to think of, after this particular course, what do I want them to be able to do? And sitting down and asking myself that question before I start designing my class is really important. So then I can identify, what do I want to see my students do? What do I want them to produce at the end? And then how do I then work backwards from there? Really helping myself is focusing on those course objectives and course outcomes. I find that especially when I am working with a class that I've taught on the ground so many times, I've built up this whole bank of activities that I almost feel obligated to include. And it really took a lot of control to focus in on what are those objectives in my course and how am I really going to have my students demonstrate their learning. And sometimes I had to take away some activities that I maybe really liked and on the ground, but I found that really focusing on just the essential activities and the essential learning not only made my online class more manageable for me as the professor, but also more manageable for my students, because they really saw a very clear alignment between the course objectives and the outcomes and the activities that they were actually doing in their online class. And so it took me a while, but I really learned that my in-class activities didn't always equate to what I was doing in an online class. And again, that process really helped me in managing the workload of my online class. So really identifying the purpose and aligning every activity, every assignment that I was having my students do in an online class. And this was a lot of work at the beginning, but as I'm rolling out my class, it really did lessen the load for me. And I was able to then focus on the feedback for my students and the learning process versus then trying to create a lot more content for them. So the second focus of our trainings is universal design for learning. And really the concept of universal design is making content accessible, again, for as many students as possible, whoever is logging in. And so the three main components of universal design for learning are multiple means of engagement. So how are we making sure that our students are engaged and motivated in our content? How do we then provide that so that they want to learn, they want to log in and complete our activities? Multiple means of representation. So how are we then providing the essential content for our students in a variety of different ways so that no matter what their learning preference is, they're able to then relate to the content and then access it appropriately. And so, for example, it might be something where we provide an option for a video, an option for a reading, or an option for a podcast to engage with the similar content. And then finally, multiple means of expression. So are we always dependent on writing for our students to convey their understanding, or can we provide some choice? And often these three components of universal design for learning go together. Maybe I allow a student to have a choice. You can either write your notes, you can speak your notes, and so that pulls in multiple means of engagement because my students have a choice, and providing options for multiple means of expression. And so all of our training videos are really going to touch on these two focuses: identifying the essential learning and using universal design for learning as we design our courses. And so I wanted to provide an example of how I kind of go through and have identified the essential learning for my classes. And so this is an evidence chart that I had in a syllabus from an undergraduate course, and it was an introductory course for special education. And so here you can see in the left column, I have my course objectives, my outcomes, and then where the evidence of student learning was. And so what I find really helpful before I'm designing my online course is going through and thinking about, how are my students demonstrating their learning in my on-the-ground class? And I initially tended to then convert all of my evidence for learning from on the ground into online. And sometimes for me, I put myself in an unmanageable position where I had so much to do and my students were getting confused, and it was a lot for me to manage. And so what I really needed to do is take a step back and think about, what do I really want them to know? So for example, how are my students going to demonstrate an understanding of the impact of moderate to severe disabilities? Does it really need to be a discussion, or is that something, since it's a lower level sort of a goal, can it be something where they're just submitting their notes to me? And so really kind of going through and see, do I need to give a midterm in order to assess my students' ability to do this? And so I did this process, and it really helped to declutter things. So I just took these three objectives first to show you. And so now I'm going to move to the next slide where my online conversion happened. So as I mentioned, I took the objectives and the outcomes, and I really thought about, well, if I give my students the content, or if they're reading a chapter in their book, if I provide some guiding questions for them and they can answer them, that really is evidence of this learning. And for me, that assessment and that activity does meet that objective. And that's a lot cleaner for me. I can provide that support for my students, and they can give me that evidence to show their learning. And the next step, because my outcome was discuss, I really thought about, this is where the discussion board could go for this class at this point. Because I then thought a little bit further that maybe I could give them a case study, since we're talking about collaboration here. And I can give my students a case where they then are analyzing what's happening in a case study. And we'll talk more about discussion boards later on, but rather than having a discussion board for each of these, really thinking about which of these objectives lends itself the best to a discussion board. And then finally, looking at writing a measurable IEP, whereas a legal document for special ed, I really kept that same activity because that was something that was important, but rather than it being something that is at the same time or a synchronous activity, allowing this to be submitted to me so that then I can provide some feedback. And so really thinking about not only what the activities are and what the essential learning is, but also how we're presenting that and how we're then rolling it out is the next step. So once we've narrowed down our essential learning, then we can look and make the decision as to how are we then going to present this content. And that's where one of the options could be synchronous learning. And I have found that some of my synchronous sessions are more successful when my students do have their videos on, right? When we have some of those face-to-face interactions, but a lot of students don't have that ability to turn their camera on. They might feel uncomfortable with the situation. I know at this point there might be a lot of distractions happening. So what I found is that I'm offering weekly live sessions, but they're optional. And for me, that allows the students who need that face-to-face interaction and kind of want that individual support to come, but for the students who are unable to do it at that time, whether it's technology challenges or scheduling challenges, it's not required. And I find that that is a really nice balance for me, And what I do is I frame these live sessions as if you need help, if you need support, and I'm going to review the assignments for the week, but I'm not delivering any content. We might interact about content if students have questions, but it's really just kind of like open office hours during that class period. So that's the next one, is you can also hold class-specific office hours in a synchronous way, again, so that students can feel that personalized support, and it's not increasing that stress for the requirement to be online for a certain number of time. But then your other option is to also have synchronous discussions and really kind of thinking about planning a synchronous session to be more student-led and having students then discuss and talk about content. So then me as the professor can really see, how did they understand that content, rather than me using that live session to then deliver the content. So the next way is asynchronous. And what is really nice about delivering something where students can have a choice and work at their own pace is that it allows for that increased flexibility. And again, when we think about universal design for learning, students can be more engaged with this content because they can work through it at their own pace. What can be more challenging is that some students might not be prepared for this level of independence. And so what I try and do is provide some guides and some intervals of work for them to kind of keep them rolling through the week as they go through their work. But that's where sometimes those live check-ins can be very helpful. But what I like about the asynchronous is that it gives opportunity for more feedback. As a student submits work, you can then provide the feedback and then hand it back, and it can be more fluid versus a live session that sometimes, when a large class, can be very difficult to give individualized feedback to students. And so what really sets the whole stage for your expectations and laying the groundwork for your class is the syllabus. And one of the things that is so important in an online class is being transparent about your expectations and really outlining for your students, what are you expecting in your online class? If you are having asynchronous assignments, how do you want them handed in? When do you want them handed in? If you're having live sessions, what are you expecting from your students when they arrive? What are some of the technology tools you'll be using? And I find that that's a strategy that's been very helpful for me, is to be transparent at the beginning. Throughout this class, we're using these tools so that my students can kind of get familiar, and it's not a surprise when maybe in week 5 a new tool appears. And again, providing that transparency as to when and if there are the asynchronous versus the synchronous classes, so that our students can really prepare and think about, do I need additional support in my own schedule to provide the best learning environment for myself so that I can be engaged and ready. And that's something that, as in our syllabus, if we can be as clear and transparent as possible, it allows our students to truly prepare for online learning. So being transparent as to what we're expecting from them, and also the communications, really talking about, what are your email expectations for them? What are your email expectations in a response from you? And I find that adding that in the syllabus is a really important aspect, again, to help with that transparency. So I wanted to provide some examples for you. So these are 2 blurbs that I've used in my syllabus to really talk about my expectations for participation. And so in the first one, this was really focusing on a class where I had, as I mentioned, those synchronous classes that were optional. And I really just kind of talked about the purpose of the synchronous sessions, the options, and then what I did is I recorded them and posted them on Blackboard for my students to review if they wanted to and they couldn't make the session. And then what I also found is really important is the expectations for the live sessions. And so really focusing on how do we create an effective learning environment. And I found that just these couple of sentences on what I'm looking for, my expectations for the learning environment when they're in a live session, has really helped the quality of my synchronous sessions. And so understanding that students might not feel comfortable with the video, but asking them to turn it on if they do, and encouraging them to take a break if they need one as well. So the dynamics are much different from on the ground classes. And so I really find that being, again, transparent, that it's okay to take a break and step away from your computer, right on my syllabus is again just showing my students these are my expectations in this new environment, and it just helps with that transparency in our online learning community. And so that's the introductory video. So please continue on as we dive a little bit deeper in each of these sections and help you as you convert your class into an online format.